The moment Marcus walked into that coffee shop, he wanted to turn around and walk straight back out. He had known that something was off when his friends had been too eager, too smiley, too insistent that he just go, just this once, what's the worst that could happen? He had spent 3 years saying no to every setup, every blind date, every well-meaning coworker with a cousin who was perfect for him. 3 years of raising his daughter alone, of falling asleep on the couch with half-eaten grilled cheese on the coffee table and cartoon reruns still playing on the TV. 3 years since the world had quietly rearranged itself into something he barely recognized. And now, here he was, in a blue-gray cafe that smelled like cinnamon and espresso, wearing the one collared shirt that didn't have a crayon stain on it, feeling like the loneliest man on earth. But then he saw her, and everything he had planned to say dissolved before it even formed. Before we go any further into this story, if you believe in second chances, in unexpected kindness, and in the idea that love sometimes finds you when you've completely stopped looking, hit that like button right now, share this video with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. We are a community built on stories that remind us what it means to be human. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? We want to know every corner of the world this story reaches. Marcus Reeves had not always been a man who wore his exhaustion like a second skin. There had been a version of him, not so long ago, who laughed easily, who made plans on Fridays and kept them, who believed that the life he was building with his wife Carla was something permanent and solid, like a house built on bedrock. They had met in their final year of college, fallen into each other the way young people do, with a confidence that the world owed them a happy ending. When their daughter Nora was born, small and pink and furious, Marcus had cried in the hospital corridor in a way he had never cried before, not from grief, but from the overwhelming weight of something that felt sacred. Then Carla got sick, and then, 18 months after the diagnosis, she was gone. Nora had been 2 years old. She didn't remember her mother in any concrete way, only in the vague, soft impressions that lodged themselves in children without explanation. The faint smell of a particular shampoo, a preference for yellow flowers, a habit of humming while she drew. Marcus kept those impressions alive the best he could. He framed photographs. He told bedtime stories where Mama was always the bravest character. He kept a small bottle of Carla's perfume on the shelf in his bedroom, not to grieve, but to remember that she had been real, that the love had been real, that Nora came from something beautiful. But life does not pause for grief. It just keeps moving, indifferent and relentless, and Marcus had to move with it. He worked as a structural engineer at a mid-sized firm, the kind of job with just enough flexibility that he could pick Nora up from school himself on most days, help her with her drawings and her impossible questions about the universe, cook the pasta she liked and pretend not to notice when she fed half of it to the dog under the table. He had built a routine that was functional, even warm in its own way. But it was also deeply, quietly lonely. His friends, Theo, Ray, and a man named Colton, who had known Marcus since freshman year, had watched this quiet loneliness grow for 3 years and said nothing. They respected the grief. They waited. But as Nora started kindergarten and Marcus started moving through his days with a kind of mechanical steadiness that looked too much like resignation, they decided that waiting was no longer an act of respect. It had become an act of neglect. The plan they hatched was, in their own words, mostly a joke. Ray had been seeing a woman named Petra, who had a close friend, a woman named Sarah, who had recently moved to the city for work, and who Petra described as warm, funny, and entirely too good at being alone. Ray had casually mentioned this to Theo over drinks one evening, and the idea had snowballed from there with the reckless enthusiasm of men who meant well but were also, undeniably, having a little fun with it. They told Marcus it was a casual group lunch. They told Sarah something similar. Then they arranged for it to be just the two of them at a corner table in a quiet cafe on a Saturday morning and claimed to have forgotten to show up themselves. Marcus figured it out about 30 seconds after texting Theo and receiving a response that was suspiciously cheerful and full of excuses. He stood at the entrance of the cafe, phone in hand, the autumn light falling through the large glass windows, and he almost left. He genuinely, seriously almost left. He told himself he was too tired for this, too set in his ways, too far gone from the version of himself who had known how to be new to someone. Then he looked up and saw the woman sitting alone at the corner table, and something in his chest did a thing it hadn't done in a very long time. She wasn't doing anything remarkable. She was just sitting there with her coffee, her curly blonde hair catching the light, her blue dress the color of a clear sky in October. She had her chin tilted slightly toward the window, and there was something in her expression. Not sadness exactly, but a kind of quiet thoughtfulness, a person comfortable with their own company, but not entirely content with it, that Marcus recognized in a way that went beyond words. She looked, he thought, like someone who had also been through something, like someone who had learned to carry things gently because she knew what it felt like when they were dropped. He walked over. He sat down across from her. He told her he was almost certain they had both been set up as a joke. She looked at him for a moment, and then she laughed, a real laugh, unguarded and surprised, and said she had figured that out about 10 minutes ago, but had decided the coffee was too good to waste. That was how it started. Serafina Voss, Sarah, to everyone who knew her, had come to the city for a fresh start, though she was careful never to use that phrase out loud because it sounded, she thought, like something from a motivational poster. The truth was more complicated. She had spent 6 years in a relationship that had slowly, politely, entirely dismantled her sense of herself. Her ex-partner, a man who was charming in public and quietly critical in private, had a way of making her feel grateful for small mercies and foolish for wanting more. She had not recognized this pattern while she was inside it. Most people don't. It was only after she left, after a long conversation with her sister that stretched past midnight and ended with both of them crying on the phone, that she began to understand how far she had drifted from the woman she used to be. She had taken the job in the new city because it was a good opportunity and because she needed distance. She had accepted Petra's invitation to meet someone because Petra had looked at her over dinner one evening and said with great seriousness, "Sarah, you deserve to remember that you are interesting and worth knowing." Sarah had rolled her eyes at the time, but here she was, and sitting across from a man who had just openly admitted to being the victim of an elaborate prank, who was looking at her with a kind of unguarded honesty that she hadn't expected. She felt something ease in her chest. Not excitement exactly. She was too cautious for that. But something. A loosening. The faint sense of a door somewhere in her, not opening, but at least becoming visible again. They talked for 2 hours that first morning. Not about big things at first, just easy things, the way conversations start when people are feeling each other out carefully. She learned that he had a daughter named Nora who was 5 and currently obsessed with sea creatures and had recently informed him that she wanted to be a scientist who talks to octopuses. He laughed when he said it, and the love in his face was so plain and so unperformed that Sarah felt something in her respond to it instinctively. She had grown up watching her own father love his children that openly, that completely, and she had always believed that was what real love looked like. Not grand gestures, but the unremarkable, daily, total devotion of someone who shows up. She told him about her work. She was a landscape architect, someone paid to think about how people moved through space and what made them feel safe or alive or curious. She talked about a project she was currently designing, a community garden for a neighborhood that had been through a difficult few years, and how she wanted it to feel not just beautiful, but useful, like a place where people could come when they needed to remember that growing things was still possible. Marcus listened in a way that she wasn't used to, not waiting for his turn to speak, actually listening. When they finally stood up to leave, both slightly astonished by how much time had passed, Marcus asked if he could see her again. He said it plainly, without performance, and then immediately added that he understood if she'd had her fill of being ambushed by her friend's good intentions. Sarah had smiled and said she thought she could probably manage one more ambush as long as she was warned in advance this time. Their second meeting was a walk through a park on a gray Sunday afternoon. He brought Nora, which he later told Sarah he had done partly as a test, not of Sarah, but of himself, because he had always believed that the surest way to understand your own feelings was to watch the person through your daughter's eyes. Nora was not shy. She was, in fact, so thoroughly unshy about her opinions and observations that Marcus sometimes marveled at how such a small human could take up so much space in a room. She assessed Sarah within about 45 seconds, asked her 3 rapid-fire questions about fish, and then reached up and took her hand while they were walking because she said she wanted to show her something at the pond, and it was easier with 2. Marcus walked just slightly behind them, watching his daughter lead this woman he barely knew toward the edge of the water with total confidence, and felt something break open in his chest in a way that frightened him a little. He hadn't realized how much room there still was inside him. He had assumed he had organized everything into neat, manageable compartments. Grief here, hope there, the daily work of raising Nora in the largest compartment of all. But watching this scene, he understood that what he had actually done was seal certain rooms off entirely. And standing here, in the cold Sunday air, with the smell of the lake and the sound of his daughter's voice pointing out a duck, one of those sealed rooms was creaking open. He missed Carla. He would always miss Carla. That wasn't the thing that frightened him. What frightened him was discovering that missing her and wanting more did not have to be a contradiction. That love was not a finite resource you could run out of. That he was, still and against his expectations, a man with a whole heart. The weeks that followed were slow and careful and full of small revelations. Sarah and Marcus fell into a rhythm of weekend afternoons and occasional weekday evenings when Nora was asleep. And Marcus's neighbor, an older woman named Bev, who adored Nora and had a standing offer to babysit, was available. They talked the way people talk when they have been lonely and are finally finding their way back to connection, with both relief and caution, offering things carefully, watching to see how they were received. Sarah told him, eventually, about the years with her ex. She didn't tell it all at once, because some things take time to voice. But she told him enough that he understood the particular kind of damage that gets done when someone is made to feel small by someone they trusted. Marcus listened without interrupting, without trying to fix it, without offering the opinions she hadn't asked for. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said that she struck him as someone who had always known her own worth, even when she'd been convinced otherwise. That she seemed like a person who had come through something hard and come through it intact. Sarah had pressed her lips together and looked out the window for a moment. Then she had looked back at him and said that was one of the kindest things anyone had said to her in years, not because it was flattery, but because it was specific, because he had seen her. Nora, meanwhile, had decided with characteristic certainty that Sarah was her favorite person after her father and Bev and the octopus exhibit at the aquarium. She drew a picture of the 3 of them one evening, Marcus, tall and slightly lopsided, Sarah with a dramatic swirl of curly hair, and herself in the middle with what appeared to be a large fish under one arm, and presented it to Sarah the next time she came over with the gravity of someone offering a gift of enormous significance. Sarah had looked at the drawing for a long moment, and when she looked up, her eyes were bright. She told Nora it was the best drawing she had ever seen and that she was going to frame it. She did, eventually. She put it on the wall of her apartment, where it hung next to a print she had bought at a market years ago. And every morning when she saw it, she felt the particular warmth of knowing that she had been included in something small and real and entirely genuine. There was an evening, about 3 months after the cafe, that Marcus would later think of as the moment he understood what was happening. They were in his kitchen, late, after Nora had gone to bed. Sarah had stayed for dinner, and they were cleaning up together in that easy, unspoken way that only happens when two people have stopped performing for each other. The radio was on low, and the kitchen was warm, and Sarah was drying a bowl and humming something softly under her breath. And Marcus looked over at her and felt, simply, completely, without drama, that the house felt right in a way it hadn't in a very long time. He didn't say anything then. He kept washing dishes, and the moment passed, as moments do. But later, when he was alone, he thought about what he would say if he were brave enough to say it out loud. He thought about what it would mean to ask someone to step into a life that was already so full of a child who carried the memory of another woman, full of a grief that had become structural, built into the architecture of his days. He thought about whether it was fair to offer someone that, to ask someone to love not just him, but the whole complicated, imperfect, beautiful situation that came with him. He thought about it for 2 more weeks. And then, one evening, sitting across from her at a small restaurant, the kind of place with candles on the table and a menu written on a chalkboard, he looked at her and said what he had been holding. He said that he knew this had started as a joke, that he knew the odds had been against it from the beginning and that neither of them had been looking. He said he had a daughter who needed him to be careful and thoughtful and sure. He said he had been afraid, genuinely afraid, of feeling this way again, because the last time he had let himself love someone completely, losing her had remade him into a different person than he had expected to be. He said all of this plainly and without apology, and then he said that in spite of all of it, or maybe because of all of it, he was falling in love with her, and he needed her to know that he meant it with everything he had. Sarah was quiet for a moment that felt much longer than it was, and then she reached across the table and put her hand over his, and she said that she had spent 6 years with someone who never once made her feel the way Marcus made her feel after 3 months. She said she had come to this city looking for herself, and she had found, unexpectedly and without planning for it, someone who made her feel both seen and safe. She said she wasn't afraid. She said yes. If this story moved something in you, if it reminded you that it's never too late to find your way back to love, that the unexpected things are sometimes the most real, that second chances don't announce themselves, they just appear quietly in a cafe on a Saturday morning, please like this video right now, share it with someone you love, and leave a comment below telling us what this story meant to you. Your engagement means more than you know. It tells us to keep sharing these stories. It tells us that these things still matter. Months later, Theo and Ray and Colton would take full credit for the whole thing. At a dinner that Marcus and Sarah hosted together for the first time, in the house that was gradually becoming their house, Theo raised a glass and made a speech that went on considerably longer than necessary, describing himself as the architect of happiness and a visionary in the field of romantic intervention. Marcus laughed and shook his head and looked across the room at Sarah, who was sitting with Nora in her lap. The two of them bent over a book about deep-sea creatures, Nora's small finger tracing the outline of an anglerfish, while Sarah read the caption aloud in a voice that was patient and warm and entirely natural. Marcus watched them, and he thought about the morning he had almost turned around and walked away from the door of that cafe. He thought about how close he had come to choosing the safety of his sealed rooms over the terrifying possibility of this, and he felt, settling into him like sunlight through a window, something that he recognized after so long as genuine, uncomplicated happiness. Before he walked over to them, he paused for just one moment, not from hesitation, from gratitude, because some things deserve to be noticed in the second before they happen, held for just a breath, before you step forward into them and let them become your life. Before we close, we want to know, did this story remind you of someone? Have you ever found something beautiful in a moment you almost walked away from? Tell us in the comments below. Your story matters to this community. That's the power of showing up. Even when you're tired, even when you've been hurt, even when someone else thinks it's a joke. Because sometimes the joke becomes the story you tell for the rest of your life. And the person at that corner table, with the coffee and the quiet eyes and the whole unwritten future ahead of them, they were waiting for you all along.